In this video, I am going to show you layer styles, and layer styles are a really awesome way to add some cool features to your layers. Now, there's a lot of options in the layers style, so in this video, I'm not going to get into every detail of every option. I suggest you go in and mess around with them, and then also look on Adobe's website for more information, but I'll give you the basics of how they work so that you can begin using them. Now, a layer style will work on the information of that layer, especially when there is transparency. So if we add a layer style to this background or just a regular image, you're not going to notice anything happening. There's not going to be any style or effect applied. We need to make sure that we have some kind of transparency happening. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. And there's a couple different ways we could go about doing this. We can create a rectangle, and then we could fill this in if we want to. So let's fill it in, and we'll just give it a color so that it's nice and easy to see. So we'll just give it this blue color. Okay, so we have our background, and we have layer 1. Let's just call this rectangle. And as I work in layers, I like to name things so I always know what it is. It gets real confusing when you have 20 layers and they're all called layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. So begin naming your rectangles is a nice tip for you there. So here we have a rectangle layer, and you can see that we have some transparency around this. Now, when we apply a layer style, it's going to apply it to everything where there's pixel information and it's not transparent. So just to prove this point a little more, let's go ahead and create an ellipse here at the bottom, and we'll fill this in. Just give it some random color. Okay, so that's filled in. Now both of these are on this layer, so let's call it shapes because it's no longer a rectangle. Okay, and you'll see it happen on both of these, and the reason why is because it's looking for any pixel information for this layer, which includes this circle and this rectangle. So let's see, how do we apply a layer style? Well, you can do it down here at the bottom under the effects button. And when we click on that, we have all of our layer styles, and then we have blending options, so the different ways that we can blend it, but it's all going to pretty much pull up the same screen. So we have bevel and emboss, stroke, inner shadow, inner glow, satin, color overlay, color gradient overlay, pattern overlay, outer glow, and a drop shadow. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is a bevel and emboss. Now, the minute that I click on that, you can see some changes are happening already, and a bevel and emboss has been applied to these layers. Now, it's finding out the information where there's not transparency, including the bottom of the circle, and applying that bevel and emboss here. It opens up this document window that you can see here, and it's going to apply to that whole layer. So because both of these are on there, it's applying it to that layer. So we have bevel and emboss, and again, I'm not going to go through all these settings in this video, but we have the different styles. So we could do an outer bevel, we could do an emboss, which gives us this nice button look. We can change things like the depth, and the great thing is you'll see a little preview over here on the right hand side. We can say the direction, how big we want it, or how small we want it. We can soften it. We can change the direction that the light is coming from, and all these other things. Altitude, the contour, the shape that it's making around the edges, the highlighting mode, the opacity, the shadow mode, and its opacity, and so forth. So go ahead and play around with these settings, or check Adobe's documentation for a little more information. It's a bit much to get into this course, but I do want to show you all of these. So that's the bevel and emboss. You can also give it a contour, which is the way that the light is going to be shaped around it. So when I click on this contour, it's different from this one. This is an even contour from 0 to 100. This starts low, goes high, and comes low again. This is the inverse of that. And these are the contour edges that you see. So they're going to give you different effects based on the contour that you have chosen here. Now, I've created courses on doing text effects, and you might want to check that out because I kind of show you how to do some of these different things using these layer styles because they're super powerful. You can also give it a texture, so you can select a pattern here and it will apply a texture to your bevel and emboss, and you can change things like the scale if you want to scale it down and make it less textured or more textured, and talk about how much depth you want to give it. So we can go to 0 and have none, or we can bump it up and have a little bit of texture. We can invert it, and so on. So layer styles are very powerful because they're affecting the whole layer. And as you begin doing graphic design and photography and all these different things, you'll find a lot of uses for these layer styles. Let me go ahead and run through the rest of them real quick for you, just so that you can see how they work. We have the bevel and emboss. We have a stroke. Now you already know what a stroke is, but the stroke allows us to apply it to the whole layer. So here you can see this stroke is being applied. And what's great is you see a preview as I begin working, so you can see it in real time affect that layer. With strokes, we can change the position, the inside, the outside, or the center. We can change its blending mode, its fill type, so we can make it a color. We can make it a gradient if we want to, so it goes from black at the bottom to white at the top, or you can make it radial if you want it to radiate outwards. So all these different options, or you can do a pattern stroke also here. So you can see, let me pick like this color one might be a little easier to see, but you can stroke it with a pattern. So you could have maybe a rope looking pattern going around this object or this layer here and give it a really cool effect. Inner shadow is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to cast a shadow. It's a little different than bevel and emboss because this is an actual shadow that's being cast based on the direction of the light, and then you can change the distance of where you want that shadow to cast. You can see as I move it up, it actually gets the circle casting onto that rectangle at one point. So the inner shadow does just that, and you can change all these different settings for the shadow. Inner glow is just what it sounds like. It gives a soft, nice inner glow to your image, and you can make that more or less opaque. You can introduce noise into it, give it a different technique and the quality and the contour. Satin is going to give this nice little finish across the image as if it looked like satin. Now this is a little trickier to get right and mess around with, but you can give this a color and it will produce this satin looking effect across the image based on how you set the blending mode and the angle of light and different things. So we can change the angle here and change the distance. So if it's all the way up, it's a lot sharper. We can bring it down and make it look less. So it's giving this satin kind of overlay. You can see it being changed here in the preview window, and we can click on the contours and change that out however we would like. Now, another thing about the contours, they are curves, so you can also go in and adjust these yourself if you want to do that too. Color overlay is going to overlay a new color on top of what other color you have. So here we have blue and magenta. When I select that, it's selected to gray and it overlays a gray color. So we can change this to any color we want. Let's just do green. And then we can adjust the opacity. So the green and the blue make cyan, the green and the magenta make kind of a gray color. So we can overlay a solid color. We can change the blending mode. So if we want to darken or add a screen to that, we can. And we'll talk about blending modes here in just a little bit. We can also do a gradient overlay. It's the same thing as a color overlay, only this time you're applying a gradient across the layer itself. And you can change its angle, the style, the blending mode. So this gives you a lot of options. Same thing, a pattern overlay. This would be just like the color or the gradient overlay, only here it's a pattern, and by messing around with the scale, you can see this is really high, but as I bring it down, it gives a pattern or a texture to that image. That might be a little hard to see. Maybe I can pick one of these. There you go. So here we can add a pattern, and hopefully it's a repeating pattern that you can add as an overlay to this layer. And then we have outer glow, which is just like inner glow. You're not going to see it here unless I turn on this background and fill it. Let's go ahead and make this black real quick just so you can see. And we will pick outer glow. It works just like inner glow, only it's going to, of course, glow to the outside. And so we can change the spread, the size, the softness. So turn the opacity down, the softness, so we can make things glow like that with all the different settings. And then finally, we can have a drop shadow. Again, I'll have to turn this back. Let's undo that so it turns white. And and we'll go ahead and click drop shadow, and this is going to give us a shadow on the outside of the layer. So this is pretty common. You see this a lot in web design and graphic design work, just to make the image stand off a little bit. Let's thicken it up, but it just makes the layer stand away from the layer below it by casting a little bit of a shadow. And the shadow is based on that transparent information that we talked about at the beginning. Here you can see the circle is also getting that shadow because there's actually transparent information there. So you can adjust all these, but let's go ahead and save this. And when I hide this layer, it's harder to see the shadow. It's still there, but it's looking at the edges of this circle and then casting the shadow from those edges where the transparency begins, and that's why you can see that. So that's a outer shadow. That's another very popular one that you might use. And then what's really cool is as you adjust the layer, it will actually add in these effects automatically. So what does that mean? If I go to the eraser tool, and you imagine I'm going to erase out the center, and when I do, it's not going to give me a white background. It's going to be a transparent background. Keep that in mind. But I'm going to turn on the white background just so you can see this. When I begin erasing, it's taking that layer style and remembering that information and still applying it. So even though I'm cutting away here, it's adding that outer shadow, which is a really, really cool effect. I mean, you can do all kinds of different things like this. You could bring in text and cut it out of here, and when you do it, it looks like this paper's been chiseled away from the text because it drops a shadow, and it looks like that's sitting above the layer below it, which is just a white layer. But when I hide that white layer, you can see it's just transparency and a shadow applied to that layer. And then you can always go in and edit these. That's another great thing about layer styles and adjustment layers is they work in a non-destructive mode. So as long as I don't flatten this image or merge this down into another layer, I can always come back in here and make changes later on if something doesn't look right. So that is how we use layer styles inside of Photoshop. I know it's a lot to take in, but they're a lot of fun. So get in there and play around with them a little bit, and then we'll move on and take a look at how we can do other things with layers, such as using masks and layer adjustments.